Ezra Levant here outside the Lethbridge courthouse. As you can see, there are a number of police. There's some other journalists, even including from the mainstream media. We're gathered here because this is the first of 2 days of the sentencing of the so-called Coutts Three. Those were 3 of the men charged with mischief for participating in the trucker convoy-style blockade at the border between Alberta and Montana in January and early February of 2022. It was a peaceful protest, and in fact it disbanded when there was the allegation that someone had brought firearms. But I say again, it was a completely peaceful event. The 3 men who were charged here today were not involved in any way with firearms, but they were charged for, like I say, mischief. And the trial it was quite a lengthy trial. It was a jury trial, and the jury found the men guilty. So what's happening today, like I say, is the first of 2 days for sentencing. There was a bit of a curveball. The very first thing we heard was that one of the 3 men, Alex Van Herk, had dismissed his lawyer. I don't know exactly what that was for. I heard rumors, but really all that matters is his particular sentencing hearing will happen later, perhaps 30 days from now, while Alex Van Herk gets another lawyer. But the other 2 men proceeded, and the prosecutor, Stephen Johnson, brought evidence about Marco van Huigenbos, the so-called leader of the movement, and played various video clips and read various tweets about him. The reason for that was not to prove guilt. Like I say, the jury found the men guilty, but the prosecutor, Stephen Johnson, went on at length trying to demonstrate that Marco van Huigenbos was completely unrepentant, and that he knew what he was doing, and that he chose to break the law knowing there would be consequences. It was a very interesting thing to hear a policeman detail this. But in cross-examination and then later in argument, the judge very much engaged in this with Marco van Huigenbos' lawyer, Brendan Miller. The question was, is a lack of remorse an aggravating factor? And I think the answer for that is no. If you are remorseful, it gives you credit, but simply not agreeing with your conviction is not something that yields a larger sentence. And as Brendan Miller, the lawyer for Van Huigenbos, repeatedly said, being upset with the system, being upset with the prosecutor, being upset with the court is not a crime and should not be the subject of an increased sentence. I say again, these 3 men were peaceful. They were amongst 300 men who were at the border those days. Of course, Rebel News was there in force. We had 2 reporters. We even made a documentary about it, and we sent lawyers in to help give the men advice in real time. And we have been crowdfunding the legal defense for several of the men. Like I say, Alex Van Herk fired his lawyer recently, so Rebel News is defending George Janzen by crowdfunding for the Democracy Fund. But I think the judge in this case is very engaged, and I think he seems open-minded. And certainly today he was challenging Stephen Johnson, the prosecutor, on many of the things Johnson was saying. And I think this judge is taking this case extremely seriously, as he should, as any judge should. But I think this judge knows how important this is to the community. And indeed, the hearing today was in the largest courtroom of the Lethbridge court. It was packed with friends and family of the accused. They have large families. And actually, for the first time, there was a significant media presence from the mainstream media. I was happy to see that, by the way. Other people who I've seen here are Arthur Pavlovsky, the Christian pastor from Calgary, who came down during the blockade to give a sermon pep talk to everyone. I see Art Hanger, the former Conservative member of Parliament, was here as well to show moral support. So I think the judge knows that this is being scrutinized very heavily, not just by the community, but his ruling will most likely be appealed no matter what it is. If it's a conviction, the conviction was already issued by the jury, but the sentence may well in itself be appealed by either side. So I think the judge is being very careful. He's a very smart judge, I've got to say. What's so interesting is how ungovernable these men are. And I say that in a loving way. That was actually the name of the documentary film we made about the protest. We called it Ungovernable because these men refused to passively go along with the lockdowns and the COVID mandates and the no-fly list and the absurdities of the pandemic. They were, quote, ungovernable in that way, and that's why they stood up, and that's why they brought the government of Alberta to its knees on this issue. I should say that the Alberta blockade is what made Jason Kenney blink. And in fact, the trucker convoy national, he made Trudeau blink. He overreacted. He brought in martial law, which, of course, I would say is the beginning of the end of Justin Trudeau if you track his poll numbers. So these men who were so ungovernable in January and February of 2022, is it surprising that they're irascible and like prickly porcupines in a legal system that is about submission and conformity? And so the fact that they fired lawyers and the fact that they're objecting to processes and in one case apparently violating publication bans, I suppose it's not that surprising that men who do not like to be ruled over, men who do not like to be ordered around, men who are used to the freedom of southern Alberta, perhaps the freest place in Canada, they don't take well to these processes. And I can see their point. I mean, as I mentioned earlier today, every single week in this country, we see massive illegal street protests, blocking roads, blocking sidewalks, trespassing, mischief, vandalism, uttering threats, and serious death threats. And the police have not taken steps because those protesters, many of whom are masked, some even flying terrorist flags, are pro-Hamas anti-Semites. So you can imagine if you're a peaceful protester who blocks the highway in southern Alberta for a few days in the name of freedom, and you are put through a lengthy punitive trial, and in another case, the case of the Coutts Four, held in prison for years, the double standard is shocking. The two-tier standard is shocking. How is it that these law-abiding, peaceful truckers and farmers who, for once in their life, stand up to the government, are smashed down with a sledgehammer, whereas every single week, people, including many foreign nationals, break the laws with impunity, and police don't act, and the media turn a blind eye? It undermines one's faith in the justice system, and you can imagine that a man who would be freedom-oriented, as the three defendants here are, would bristle at that. So it's not particularly surprising that people who would rise up against lockdowns would also chafe against the legal process. If I recall what I heard correctly, Stephen Johnson, the prosecutor, has asked for a 9-month prison term. He called it a short, sharp shot. That's the language he used. He wanted a 9-month prison term for Marco Van Huigenbos, considered the leader of the group, and a 6-month prison term for George Janzen, who was not a leader. I think the judge immediately suggested those numbers were far too high. In the case of George Janzen, it looks like I sense that the judge is open to either a conditional sentence, which is that really George Janzen has to live under some conditions, and if he keeps his good behavior for a number of years, he'll be done without jail time, or at most serving jail time on weekends. So I sense that's where the judge is going there. I sense that certainly the prosecutor wants to throw the book at Marco Van Huigenbos and played video clips of Huigenbos poking verbally at the prosecutor, which seemed a little bit thin-skinned to me, but what do I know? So it'll be interesting to see. And this is going to continue this afternoon, and it's going to stretch into a second day. And Rebel News has been so intimately involved with these trucker convoys. As you know, we've reported every single day on the lengthy trial of Tamara Leach, the leader of the Ottawa trucker convoy in Ottawa. We've represented hundreds of people who involved in these protests, 55 in Alberta alone. We've represented many people in Windsor and, of course, Ottawa. And when I say we've covered the journalism, and we've crowdfunded, and we've passed those funds on to the charity called the Democracy Fund, who's actually provided the lawyers. So that's my update. It's very interesting. Like I say, there's some new legal players. Brendan Miller is the lawyer for Marco Van Huigenbos. We don't know who the new lawyer is for Alex Van Herk. And the Democracy Fund, Alan Honner and Adam Blake Gallipo are representing George Janzen. So a lot of legal firepower in the court. I find it interesting. I love the law. I'm interested in it. It's frustrating to me, though, to see the two-tier justice in this country. And the fact that here we are almost 3 years later shows that justice is slow. And they say justice delayed is justice denied. That's my report for now. I will give a report after the afternoon break. And it looks like we'll be here tomorrow. It sounds like the judge may be ready to issue his sentence as soon as tomorrow. And remember, that's just on the two men, George Janzen and Marco Van Huigenbos. The third man, Alex Van Herk, is at a later date. These trucker trials are moving their way through the system. Rebel News is sponsoring the legal defense of many of these men, not all of them. As I mentioned, there's some shuffling of the deck chairs on some of the lawyers. If you want to help crowdfund for the lawyers for George Janzen or some of the other cases, including Tamara Leach and others, you can go to courthouse.com. That'll let you help George Janzen. And of course, helptamara.com is where we crowdfund for her. Rebel News has always believed in freedom and citizen journalism and a little bit of activism, and that's what we're doing here. Thanks for your time, and I'm sorry my earlier video today was so noisy. There was a larger protest with a PA system this morning, and I had to get my video before I ran in. I'll keep you posted from Lethbridge, a city I visited many times following these trials. I'll have more later. Visit coutts3.com.